folks, happy Friday, TGIF, even though it's Black Friday, and apologies to anybody who's had to deal with a retail store stampede anytime since supper time last night. So anyways, we're going to talk about that sort of stuff when WWMJ resumes a little later on, but for now, let's talk about power supplies. I've got the Enermax taken apart again, pulled it out of the bin, took the lid off once again, because I want to talk about this type of stuff for a bit, in response to what I hope isn't the beginning of a flame war on my Twitter about cheap power supplies and stuff like that. If any of you folks want to get pushy on Twitter, don't. Just chill out and relax, or go do something else for an hour, or 2 hours, or a day, and come back and see just how stupid you look, picking fights over whether or not somebody knows anything about computer power supplies. I really hope that's not what's going on, but it's the internet, so never say never. So I want to talk about power supplies and exactly why this is such a big issue, because I don't flame people for this sort of stuff, but it is a big issue for me. Time and again, I've actually been in a situation where people have flamed me because they thought I was putting too much emphasis on the power supply in terms of its contribution to a computer running smoothly. I mean, it's only the most basic thing. Computers run off of, surprise, surprise, power. How good the power is that you supply to it has a lot to do with how good your computer is. It's kind of a rite of passage, actually. When you start taking computer power supplies seriously, that's when you know you've taken your first step towards moving away from the mainstream market or casual computer use towards actually being an enthusiast and maybe kind of sort of knowing what you're talking about. You gotta learn about hardware in order to finish the job, but a good first step is to realize the power supply is more important to your computer not being a pain in the neck than your processor or even than your graphics card or even your processor. The stuff that computer commercials advertise the most is useless if you're not feeding good power to it. And if you don't want a throwaway appliance instead of a proper computer, in order to have an upgrade path, you need a power supply that can handle the upgrades. So this is kind of a rite of passage. When you start taking power supplies seriously in computers, you're starting to become a computer enthusiast, and I was no exception. When I was in college, I didn't know anything about hardware. I'd been programming in QBasic on my high school's computers and things like that, but I was mostly a software guy. I had seen some folks in the electronics shop I was in high school build their own computers, Pentium 2s, playing with jumpers, things along those lines. But it was kind of intimidating because computers were expensive and I didn't want to break something, even though it actually takes less electronic skills to build a computer than it does to etch a circuit board or build a power supply like this from scratch. Etching your board, soldering in the components, the whole 9 yards. So I was actually quite surprised to find out that building computers is a tad less technical than regular industrial electronics, which I already had a background in. So I felt like an ass once I figured that out, but what are you going to do? That's life. You're stupid until you learn stuff, then you feel stupid afterwards because you start noticing that you really don't know as much as you may have bragged that you did or thought you did, or Plato's torpedo fish, right? Or whatever that was. Something I remember in my philosophy class way back in college. One little elective I took talked about a torpedo fish. I remembered it because that's the only time I've ever heard the term torpedo fish. It's almost as random as chicken fish, but that's... Anyways, so the thing with power supplies is, here I was, now my dad and I, we went computer shopping for a computer before I went off to college, and we wound up getting royally ripped off because neither of us had a clue about anything, myself included. So we paid nearly $2,000 for a piece of junk HP with a 750 megahertz Athlon. Actually, we originally ordered an 800 megahertz Athlon. Best Buy screwed it up. It was a build-to-order PC. Best Buy screwed up our order, so 50 less megahertz, but college was starting in just a couple of weeks, so I didn't really have the time to send it back and then have them turn it around without risking not having a computer on day one for a guy like me who's going to college for computer information systems. So it may have been a business degree, but it would have looked stupid if a CIS guy showed up with no computer. Especially an aspiring hotshot like myself at the time. So, Anyways, so I had an HP Pavilion 8700 BTO, one of those grayish, purplish things that HP was selling at the time. It was a desktop, a tower with a gigantic 17-inch tube monitor. That was the reason why I had to back my desk away from the dorm room wall by a couple inches everywhere I went. I did one semester where I was looking at a 45-degree angle all the time at a monitor, and yeah. I did one semester like that, and my neck was hurting by the time I went home for Christmas break, so I just backed the desk away from the wall by a couple inches, kind of like what I do with this table here. If I didn't have that lamp there, I could probably fit the tube monitor there, but that's another discussion entirely. So, yeah. But anyways, yeah, so this computer didn't make it. I wound up getting into computer hardware, and thus what you're seeing here with the Dellosaurus and tinkering with all these systems exists basically as a result of me giving Best Buy a giant FU after they blew me off and gave me the runaround when I started having computer problems halfway through college. Now, basically, we bought a service plan. It was kind of like a proto-Geek Squad type something or another. If something went wrong with the computer, Best Buy was supposed to send someone off to the college to fix it on campus, on-site service and support. That's why the service plan costs several $100s. Today you can get a computer for that price. So, yeah, it was the one and only time that I decided that I would ever get ripped off by a service plan, because I wound up building and servicing my own stuff afterwards. Yay! But anyways, so what happened was basically the power supply was terrible. In a time when 300-watt power supplies were recommended for standard systems and 350 plus started coming into the picture when you were an enthusiast building a high-end gaming machine, at a time when 300 to 350 watts was what you wanted in your system if you were building one of your own, the piece of junk that I had from the HP that I had, or excuse me, Hewlett-Packard, because it was still spelled out back in those days, the Hewlett-Packard that I had back then only had 188 watts, and it was proprietary. You couldn't buy a power supply like this and swap it in. The case, it wouldn't fit in the case. You'd have to start drilling holes and stuff, and then you had to worry about whether the motherboard connector would work. Fortunately, the motherboard connector wasn't a problem. We were able to, when I built that hack job system for my dad in the mid-2000s, combine parts with a 350 watt Antec supply, which I still have. That's sadly going to get recycled. But power supplies are important because the stability of your system depends entirely. I mean, if you don't have a good power supply, you have an appliance that can't be upgraded. And if the power supply starts giving out, you're going to start having freezes, hard locks, resets, or maybe like what I had, where the thing was browning out inside the case. So you'd be using your computer and all of a sudden the whole thing would restart all by itself and it wouldn't detect its own hard drive. Boom, hard drive not found. System wouldn't boot. But if you pulled the plug and plugged it back in, everything was normal when it started back up until the next time that happened. And here's why. Power supplies are basically battery copycat boxes. They're supposed to take the AC coming out of the wall and turn it into the DC, similar to if you had batteries inside your computer, usually like 5 volts or something. That's what all the devices and circuit boards and stuff are looking for. Now here's the thing. AC, as you know, is a sine wave. DC is flat. So you're trying to take something that's very, very different from what you want and make it into flat DC. Now, if you have ripple and stuff like that, it can affect things. If you have noise, it can affect things. But the reason why you don't want a cheap power supply is because of the way that it does what it does. So if this screws up, you can send dirty power to all your components. That's a problem. But there's some specific ways you could screw up that could kill your whole system. So, for example, the transformer that steps down the voltage from the line voltage to like 12 volts AC or something like that. It works via electromagnetic stuff. Put 2 coils of wire too close to each other, and then running current through one coil will get current going in the other coil at a different voltage. So, if this ever shorted, we'd have line voltage going to, hopefully, the next weakest component and only blowing that out. Otherwise, it would go to the whole computer, and yeah, anyways. The capacitors resist changes in voltage. They're kind of like batteries, but they don't stay charged for anywhere near as long. There's some high-capacity capacitors out there nowadays that are challenging that, like those people with those ginormous capacitors in their car that can start a car without needing a battery, but they will discharge if your car sits for too long faster than a battery. If these stop working, the power gets dirty, because by the time something's going through a filter capacitor, these things will blow up if the polarity is reversed. So you know that these are installed correctly and receiving DC in the right polarity by the simple fact that these things haven't burst or blown up yet. So it's electrolytics. The disc capacitors, there's one little green thing right there. There's a fuse too. But the electrolytics are polarized. You don't want to put them in backwards or they'll explode on you. But it's a couple of videos of that. Even V. Westlife had one blow up on his workshop bench once. But if these stop working, your power becomes dirty because it's been converted into DC, but it hasn't been smoothed out. So you're going to send dirty power, or something's going to short, or something along those lines. Basically, you want good components in here because you don't want any of these components breaking. You don't want any of this stuff breaking, because if you do, you're going to get anything from dirty power to something that could fry everything in your system. So that's why folks like myself and other enthusiasts are fanatical about power supplies. I would even go so far as to say that the prevailing wisdom of sinking tons of money into a graphics card should be changed into, if you want to sink all the money into your graphics card, sink it into your power supply as well, so you have something nice and stable that can handle what you throw at it. Even take a watt meter or something if you want, and check what you're getting up to as you run stuff full blast and things along those lines. But the thing is, don't cheap out on the power supply. How many computer commercials have you folks seen that have ever bragged about how robust the power supply is? I've never seen one in years and years and years of seeing computer commercials. Time and again, though, the power supplies you see in like office computers, retail computers, off-the-shelf systems, they are crap. They're often underpowered. Mine certainly was, and they're made more for, the device to be throwaway than to be upgradable, except for extremely few situations like the Asus M series computers that I'm a big fan of. And seriously, if I was starting over from scratch, I would buy an M series machine and then upgrade it from there. Get a new case, get a new motherboard. I'd get back into the game by buying an Asus M series and then starting over that way. One of the first things I'll be looking to upgrade, though, is the power supply. Because, the power supply slides under the radar so much, and then people get the results of a bad power supply, instability, crashes, freezes, hard locks, automatic reboots, or maybe even damage to the internal components. People get all of those symptoms and they just think their computer's a piece of crap because they bought it on sale somewhere, when in reality, fixing the power issues will fix everything else. That's what I ultimately ran into with my HP from college. I wound up building the Silver Bullet halfway through college, as a giant FU to Best Buy after giving me the runaround, but I still had, I finally got rid of the case at graduation, which I probably shouldn't have, because I've wished I could build a retro system in one of those for quite some time now. But I think some of the plastic would have yellowed by now based on what I've seen from eBay for similar computers. But what happened was my dad was using the Dellosaurus, and it was getting too slow and too awful using Windows Millennium Edition for him at the time. So what we did was we built a system for him via the best components of the Dellosaurus and the best components of my original HP, including the Athlon processor, blending them together, putting them in an Antec case with a 350 watt power supply, which is a case that to this day I still have. Right there. So, and here's the thing, as unstable and as horrible as that Pavilion was in my college years, to the extent that I got into computer hardware as a result, as unstable as that system was, putting it in a standardized case with a standardized power supply and a cooling setup that didn't go against the laws of physics. Yeah, there was an exhaust below an intake on that thing. That's how bad it was. It was recycling its own hot air. If you put a CD-ROM in the optical drives, it would cook big time, and it'd be almost hot when you took it out. You wonder how you didn't destroy your CDs. But once we fixed the power situation, the system ran and ran like a champ. Perfectly stable until the 750 megahertz cartridge-style Athlon processor just was too darn slow. And then finally it was retired because the computer was just too slow after over 10 years actually. Speaking of that processor, this is it right here. The one and only one of these cartridge style processors that I ever had. has a little bit of sentimental value, so I basically keep it as a knick-knack for the desk. And that, as they say, is that about power supplies. You need a good power supply because it's basically the backbone of the system. Lots of bad stuff can happen if the power supply is not up to what you're throwing at the darn thing in terms of power requirements. What's this? Is this dust on this thing? Maybe I have to clean this thing up. Ah, yes. Static electricity because it's static season and whatnot. So lint or particles or cobwebs flying through the air sticking to this thing. Maybe I should clean it up. Yeah, by the way, once upon a time, AMD was Team Green. Happy Thanksgiving. Okay, well, the changing of seasons has indeed occurred here in the Geek House, so get rid of that. And now we move forward with everything. It's that time of year again, folks. Do 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 do. This is so hard to do with one hand. Bah, humbug. We'll straighten that out a little later on. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.